February 17, 1917. Late morning. The western approaches, roughly 200 miles southwest of the Isles of Scilly. A shabby, slow-moving British collier wallows through a moderate swell, smoke drifting listlessly from a single funnel, her paintwork rusted, her deck cluttered with the ordinary, unremarkable gear of a tramp steamer going about tramp steamer business, to the periscope of the German submarine U-68, closing cautiously from 1.5 miles away. She's exactly what she appears to be. An easy, unescorted, unarmed target, worth a single torpedo or, better still from the U-boat's perspective, not worth wasting a torpedo on at all, when a few rounds from the deck gun would do the job just as well and leave more torpedoes in the tube for a more valuable target later. The submarine surfaces, closes to point-blank range, and opens fire with her 88mm deck gun, confident enough in the total absence of any threat that her crew worked the gun in the open, unhurried, expecting the little collier's crew to abandon ship within minutes, exactly as dozens of merchant crews had done before them under identical circumstances that year. What U-68's captain cannot see, because it has been built specifically so that he cannot see it, is that the collier's deck fittings are not fittings at all. A ventilator cowling swings away on a hinge, a lifeboat's side collapses outward, a section of what looked like ordinary deckhouse paneling drops flat onto the deck, and where a moment before there had been nothing but the harmless clutter of a merchant ship, for concealed guns run out and open fire in a single coordinated volley from less than 800 yards, at a target that has no time, no room, and no reason to expect that the ship it had just been calmly shelling was ever anything other than exactly what she looked like. This is the story of the Q-ship, the most elaborate confidence trick the Royal Navy ever built into a warship, and the collier that proved a defenseless-looking tramp steamer could kill a submarine faster than any destroyer in the fleet. The crisis that produced the Q-ship program had been building since the opening months of the war, and it sharpened into genuine desperation through 1916 and into the first weeks of 1917, driven by a form of warfare that neither the Royal Navy nor any other navy in the world had ever been required to counter at scale before. The German U-boat fleet, initially deployed in relatively small numbers and against largely conventional restrictions, requiring warning and the safety of crews before a merchant ship could be sunk, had by 1917 escalated toward the policy that would eventually be declared openly and formally as unrestricted submarine warfare. Submarines sinking merchant shipping on sight, without warning, in pursuit of a single strategic objective that German naval planners had calculated with considerable confidence, that Britain, an island nation dependent on seaborne imports for food, fuel, and the raw materials of its entire war economy, could be starved into submission faster than the United States, still officially neutral through most of this period, could be provoked into entering the war on the Allied side. The numbers, through late 1916 and into early 1917, justified German confidence entirely. Merchant shipping losses to submarine attack climbed month over month toward a rate that, by April 1917, would reach a level so catastrophic, over 860,000 tons of Allied and neutral shipping sunk in that single month alone, that Britain's own First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir John Jellicoe, would tell the War Cabinet directly that the country could not continue the war past the summer if the rate of loss was not somehow brought under control. This was not idle alarmism from a nervous officer. Jellicoe's assessment reflected a careful reading of import figures, shipbuilding capacity, and loss rates that pointed toward a genuinely narrow window in which Britain's entire seaborne economy, and by extension its ability to keep fighting at all, hung on whether the Admiralty could find some way to bring the submarine campaign under control before the arithmetic of sinkings versus new construction turned decisively and irreversibly against the Allies. Conventional naval countermeasures available in 1917 offered frustratingly little answer to the problem. Destroyers and other escort vessels existed in nowhere near sufficient numbers to accompany every merchant convoy, and the convoy system itself, which would eventually prove the single most effective countermeasure of the entire war, was not adopted in any comprehensive, systematic way by the Admiralty until May 1917, following months of institutional resistance from senior naval officers who doubted, wrongly as it turned out, that large groups of merchant ships sailing together under escort were safer than ships sailing independently and dispersed. This resistance to convoying deserves a moment's attention in its own right, since it illustrates just how unprepared the Royal Navy's institutional thinking was, even 3 years into the war, for the specific character of the threat it now faced. Senior officers argued that grouping merchant ships together simply presented a submarine with a larger, more concentrated target, and that the difficulty of coordinating the speed and navigation of dozens of independently owned and crewed merchant vessels would create more problems than it solved. It took the accumulating weight of lost statistics and pressure that eventually reached as high as the Prime Minister's own office to finally overcome that institutional skepticism and force the systematic adoption of convoying as official Admiralty policy. Anti-submarine detection technology remained genuinely primitive. Hydrophones existed, but were unreliable and short-ranged, dependent on a stationary or slow-moving listening platform, and easily confused by the ambient noise of a ship's own machinery or by sea conditions that made distinguishing a submerged submarine's propeller noise from ordinary background sound a matter of considerable guesswork. Even for a skilled operator, depth charges existed, but in limited numbers and with a design still being refined. Early patterns suffering from inconsistent detonation depths and a blast radius that required a submarine to be caught remarkably close to the point of detonation before the weapon proved reliably lethal. Aircraft could spot a surface submarine on a clear day, but could rarely do much to destroy one once found, since aircraft of the period typically lacked any weapon capable of reliably damaging a submarine's pressure hull, and a submarine sighted from the air could usually dive to safety well before an aircraft summoned surface assistance could arrive on the scene. Against this backdrop of a countermeasure toolkit that was, in early 1917, still catching up to the scale of the threat it faced, the Q-ship represented something genuinely different, not a technological answer to the submarine problem at all, but a psychological one, a deliberate exploitation of the specific tactical habits German U-boat commanders had themselves developed in response to the very shortage of torpedoes that made unrestricted warfare, paradoxically, both more devastating in aggregate tonnage and more vulnerable to exactly the kind of trap the Q-ship was built to spring. The tactical opening the Q-ship exploited grew directly out of a genuine operational constraint every U-boat captain in the war had to manage. A submarine of the period carried a strictly limited number of torpedoes, typically somewhere between 6 and a dozen, depending on the boat's class and patrol duration. Each one an expensive, difficult-to-manufacture weapon that German Naval Command expected commanders to conserve for the most valuable or most dangerous targets. Warships, troop transports, large fast liners, rather than expend on slow, unarmed, individually sailing merchant ships that could, in the great majority of cases, be dealt with far more cheaply by simply surfacing, closing to a safe range, and sinking the target with the submarine's own deck gun, a weapon typically in the 88mm to 105mm range, depending on the boat, that used ordinary gunnery shells rather than expensive torpedoes and left the submarine's limited torpedo stock available for targets that genuinely warranted it. Beyond the pure economics of torpedo conservation, gun action also carried a further practical advantage from the German perspective, in that it typically gave a merchant crew the opportunity to abandon ship before the vessel was actually sunk, a consideration that mattered to at least some U-boat commanders operating in the earlier, less absolute phases of the submarine campaign. Before the shift to fully unrestricted warfare made such considerations increasingly irrelevant to German operational practice. This preference, gun action against merchant shipping, wherever the target's apparent lack of armament and lack of any visible threat made it safe to do so, was entirely rational from the German perspective and had become, by 1917, the standard, default method by which the great majority of individually sailing merchant ships were actually sunk. It was also, precisely because it required a U-boat to surface, expose herself on the surface at comparatively close range, and commit to an extended gunnery duel rather than a single submerged torpedo strike followed by an immediate withdrawal. The single greatest tactical vulnerability the entire U-boat campaign possessed, provided the merchant ship in question turned out to be something other than what she appeared, a submarine on the surface, engaged in a gunnery duel at moderate range, sacrificed almost every one of the tactical advantages that made her dangerous in the first place. She could not dive quickly enough to escape a sudden, close-range volley of accurate fire. Her own hull, built to resist water pressure rather than direct gunfire, offered no meaningful protection against even a modest-caliber naval gun firing at short range, and her own deck gun crew, standing exposed on the casing to work their weapon, presented as vulnerable a target as any group of men could offer a hidden, well-trained gun crew waiting for exactly this moment. The Q-ship concept, first developed and refined by the Admiralty from late 1914 and into 1915 under the direction of officers including Rear Admiral Reginald Bacon, and later expanded considerably as the tactical opportunity it exploited became clearer, addressed that vulnerability directly. Take an ordinary merchant vessel, a small tramp steamer, a collier, a fishing smack, or occasionally a somewhat larger cargo ship, and convert her, with as much attention to disguise and concealment as the Admiralty's resources allowed, into a warship that looked, in every outward respect, exactly like the harmless, unarmed target a U-boat commander would consider safe to engage on the surface with his deck gun rather than waste a torpedo on. The ships selected for conversion were deliberately chosen from exactly the categories of merchant vessel that populated the shipping lanes German submarines were already hunting in the greatest numbers, precisely so that a U-boat captain scanning the horizon through his periscope would see nothing unusual, nothing that might suggest a naval vessel in disguise rather than one more ordinary tramp steamer going about her ordinary business. Roughly 200 vessels were commissioned into Q-ship service across the war under a variety of official designations intended to preserve secrecy, special service ships, mystery ships, or simply by pennant numbers and cover names that changed periodically to prevent German intelligence from building up a reliable list of known decoys, a genuine and ongoing concern given that the entire concept depended on German U-boat commanders continuing to believe, at least in the opening years of the program, that any given merchant ship they encountered was genuinely what she appeared to be. This need for constantly refreshed disguise extended even to individual ships within the program. A Q-ship that had fought and survived one engagement might be repainted, renamed, and reassigned to different waters entirely, on the theory that a submarine commander who had somehow escaped a previous encounter, or who had received a warning from a fellow captain who had, might recognize a specific vessel's silhouette or markings if she continued operating under the same identity in the same general area. The conversion process itself represented a considerable feat of naval concealment engineering, built around the single overriding principle that nothing about the ship's outward appearance, her silhouette, her paint scheme, her deck fittings, her behavior when approached, could give away the presence of the armament and the trained naval gun crews hidden aboard her. Guns, typically a mixture of smaller quick-firing weapons in the 12-pounder to 4-inch range, depending on the specific ship and her intended role, were mounted behind collapsible or hinged concealment structures built to look, from any reasonable viewing distance, like entirely ordinary merchant ship fittings, a deckhouse wall that dropped flat on hinges, a ventilator cowling or a lifeboat that swung or collapsed away to reveal the gun mounted directly beneath or behind it. A false deck cargo of crates or barrels that could be tipped or removed within seconds. The Admiralty went to considerable additional lengths to make the ship's behavior, not merely their appearance, convincing under the specific circumstances a genuine encounter with a threatening submarine would produce. Crews were drilled extensively in what came to be known as a panic party procedure, a rehearsed, deliberately theatrical simulation of a merchant crew abandoning ship in disorganized panic the moment a U-boat opened fire or was sighted approaching on the surface. A portion of the ship's company, dressed to look as unlike disciplined naval personnel as possible, would take to the lifeboats in a display of convincing disarray, shouting, apparently arguing, rowing away from the ship in a manner calculated to reinforce exactly the impression of a frightened, unarmed merchant crew fleeing a doomed vessel that the entire deception depended on, while the ship's actual fighting crew, the gun layers, the captain, and the skeleton engine room crew, remained concealed aboard, weapons manned and ready, waiting for the submarine to close to a range which the concealed guns could no longer miss, and from which the U-boat, caught on the surface at short range, with her own deck gun crew exposed and her hull entirely unarmored against direct naval gunfire, would have no realistic prospect of escape once the trap was sprung. The entire sequence, from first sighting through the panic party's departure to the moment the concealment screens dropped and the guns opened fire, might unfold over 10 or 15 minutes of sustained, disciplined theatre. Every man aboard the concealed portion of the crew hired to remain motionless and silent, in some cases lying flat on an exposed, unprotected deck, while the submarine's own gunfire straddled and occasionally struck the ship directly, absorbing genuine risk and genuine casualties in the service of maintaining a deception that could be shattered by a single premature movement, a single visible face at the wrong moment, or a single shot fired even seconds before the range and the angle were fully favorable. The psychological demands this placed on ordinary sailors, most of them not career naval officers, but men who had volunteered specifically for this unusual and unusually dangerous category of service, should not be underestimated. Lying still under genuine, aimed enemy gunfire, with strict orders not to move, not to return fire, and not to give any sign that the ship was anything other than the helpless target she appeared to be, required a form of discipline distinct from, and in some ways more demanding than, the discipline required of a gun crew aboard a conventional warship actively returning fire from the opening moment of an engagement. A Q-ship crewman's courage was tested not in the heat of active combat, but in the far harder task of doing nothing at all while under fire, trusting entirely in his captain's judgment of exactly when the moment to act had finally arrived. Before we get into the action itself, if you're finding this deep dive into WW to History Trench interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. The officer who would become the most successful and most celebrated Q-ship commander of the entire war, Lieutenant Commander Gordon Campbell, had taken command of the collier HMS Farnborough, designated Q5 within the Admiralty's Q-ship registry, in 1915, and had spent the following months and years refining the panic party procedure and the general conduct of decoy operations to a level of polish that would eventually make him, by a considerable margin, the single most decorated officer to emerge from the entire Q-ship program. Campbell brought to the role a particular combination of patience, nerve, and tactical judgment that colleagues and subordinates alike would later single out as the defining quality behind his repeated success, where a less disciplined commander might have sprung the trap too early, out of understandable anxiety at holding fire while his own ship absorbed incoming shell fire. Campbell consistently demonstrated a willingness to wait, to let the enemy close well past the point where most men would have judged the risk of waiting further to be unacceptable, precisely because he understood that the tactical value of the ambush increased the closer and more committed the submarine became before the concealment was finally broken. Farnborough herself was, in every outward respect, precisely the kind of unremarkable small collier that populated British coastal and western approaches shipping in considerable numbers. A vessel whose loss, had she genuinely been sunk by a U-boat in the ordinary course of the war, would have registered as one more entry in an already grim monthly tonnage total, rather than any kind of notable event. On the morning of March 22, 1916, Campbell and Farnborough had already achieved the programme's first genuinely confirmed submarine kill, engaging and sinking U-68 in an action that established, in practice rather than merely in theory, that the entire Q-ship concept could work exactly as its designers had intended. This first success mattered enormously to the wider programme's credibility within the Admiralty at a time when the entire Q-ship concept remained relatively new and unproven, and Campbell's demonstrated ability to execute the panic party deception successfully under genuine combat conditions helped secure continued institutional support for expanding the program through the following years, at a point when resources for any new or unconventional naval initiative had to compete against the many other, more established demands of a navy fighting a war on multiple fronts simultaneously. Campbell's second confirmed success, and the action that has become the most frequently cited single engagement in the entire history of the Q-ship program, came roughly 11 months later, in February 1917. In the action described at the opening of this account, on the morning in question, Farnborough, sailing alone and disguised precisely as the shabby, unremarkable collier her appearance suggested, was sighted and approached by a German submarine, correctly assessed by her lookouts as almost certainly intending to engage with gunfire rather than expend a torpedo on so evidently modest a target. Campbell, watching the submarine's approach from his own concealed position aboard ship, held his fire and held his nerve through the opening phase of the encounter with the specific, deliberate patience that had become his particular hallmark among Q-ship commanders, allowing the submarine to surface fully, to close the range steadily, and to begin firing her deck gun at Farnborough without any response from the collier beyond the panic party's rehearsed, convincing display of a frightened merchant crew taking to the boats in apparent disarray. The submarine, its commander evidently satisfied that he was dealing with exactly the harmless, unarmed target the ship appeared to be, continued closing the range, working his own gun crew in the open on the submarine's exposed deck casing with the unhurried confidence of a commander who believed himself to be facing no threat whatsoever. Precisely the condition under which the entire panic party deception was designed to place him. Campbell, judging the range and the angle to have close to the point at which his concealed armament could engage with maximum effect and minimum opportunity for the submarine to dive to safety, before the action was decided, gave the order to drop the concealment screens and open fire. The result was close to instantaneous and, from the submarine's perspective, close to indefensible. Farnborough's concealed guns, run out and firing within seconds of the order being given, engaged the surfaced U-boat at a range close enough that accurate, rapid, sustained gunfire could be brought to bear before the submarine's crew, caught entirely by surprise with their own gun crew exposed on deck and their vessel still on the surface, rather than submerged, had any realistic opportunity to crash dive to safety or to bring their own weapon to bear effectively against a target that had, moments before, appeared entirely defenseless. Hits were scored rapidly against the submarine's pressure hull and conning tower, the kind of direct naval gunfire that a U-boat's thin surface hull, built to withstand water pressure at depth rather than direct shell fire at the surface, had no meaningful capacity to absorb. The submarine, mortally damaged and unable either to submerge to safety or to continue an unequal gunnery duel against a target now revealed to carry considerably heavier and more numerous weapons than her own single deck gun, went down within a comparatively short span of the concealment screens first dropping, her own crew given little opportunity to abandon ship in any organized way before the vessel was lost. For this action, and building on the earlier, similarly conducted sinking of U-68 the previous year, Gordon Campbell was awarded the Victoria Cross the citation recognizing both the extraordinary discipline had to hold fire through an extended, genuinely dangerous period of incoming submarine gunfire while maintaining the panic party deception, and the tactical skill with which the trap, once sprung, had been executed to a decisive and rapid conclusion. The award reflected an official recognition, at the highest level the Royal Navy's honours system could confer, that the specific form of courage the Q-ship service demanded, sustained, disciplined restraint under direct enemy fire rather than immediate, active combat, deserved the same standing as more conventional forms of battlefield gallantry, an acknowledgement that mattered considerably to the wider standing and morale of the Q-ship service as a whole. Campbell's record over the following months only deepened his reputation as the programme's most consistently effective practitioner, commanding a further Q-ship, HMS Pargest. In June 1917, he engaged and sank the German submarine 29 in an action that closely followed the same operational pattern, extended, disciplined patience through an opening phase of incoming submarine fire, a convincingly executed panic party deception, and a decisive, close-range engagement once the submarine had committed fully to the belief that she faced no organized resistance whatsoever. The Pargest action produced a particular and, within the honours system of the period, genuinely unusual outcome. Rather than a single Victoria Cross awarded to Campbell personally, the decoration was instead awarded collectively to the ship's company as a whole, to be conferred by ballot among the crew themselves under the rarely used provision that allowed a unit, rather than an individual, to be recognized where the entire company's conduct had been judged equally deserving of the honor, a recognition that reflected how thoroughly the Q-ship's success depended not merely on a single commander's tactical judgment, but on the sustained collective discipline of an entire crew, most of them ordinary sailors, required to remain motionless, exposed, and under fire for extended periods without any of the conventional cover or protection a genuine warship's crew could expect, purely in the service of maintaining a deception on which every man's survival and the survival of the ship ultimately depended. The ballot system used to select the recipients of the Pargest Victoria Cross deserves a moment's further attention, since it illustrates how seriously the Admiralty took the principle that this specific category of collective courage could not always be fairly attributed to a single individual. Under the provision governing such awards, the ship's company itself, officers and men together, would vote among themselves to select which of their number should receive the decoration on behalf of the entire crew, a process that placed the judgment of who among them had displayed the greatest gallantry not in the hands of a distant review board, but in the hands of the men who had actually shared the danger together, a mechanism used only a small handful of times across the entire war and reserved specifically for actions in which the collective conduct of an entire crew was judged to have been so uniformly exceptional that singling out any one man's contribution above the others would have done an injustice to the rest. Not every Q-ship action of the war ended in a confirmed kill, and the programme's record, examined honestly rather than through the celebrated highlights of Campbell's own service, included a considerable number of engagements in which extraordinary crew discipline and genuine heroism produced no submarine sunk at all, and in some cases cost the Q-ship herself dearly for the attempt. The action fought by HMS Dunraven in August 1917 against the German submarine UC-71 has become, within the specific history of the Q-ship program, almost as celebrated as Campbell's confirmed successes, precisely because of rather than despite its ultimately unsuccessful outcome. Dunraven, disguised as an armed merchant vessel rather than an entirely unarmed one, a slightly different variant of the Q-ship deception, intended to draw U-boat into a prolonged gunnery duel at a range from which the ship's genuinely concealed heavier weapons could eventually be brought to bear, came under sustained and increasingly accurate fire from UC-71 over an extended engagement that saw fires break out aboard the ship, a depth charge stowage exploding and further damaging the vessel, and casualties mounting among the concealed gun crews forced to remain at their posts, in several documented instances continuing to man their positions despite serious wounds, throughout an action that stretched, in total, across roughly 2.5 hours of sustained combat. The sheer duration of the Dunraven engagement set it apart from the more rapidly concluded Farnborough actions, where Campbell's successful engagements had typically resolved within minutes of the concealment being broken. Dunraven's crew endured an extended ordeal in which the ship's own increasingly desperate condition, fire spreading, ammunition and depth charges at risk of further explosion, threatened to overwhelm the ship before her concealed guns ever had the opportunity to be used decisively at all. Dunraven's crew maintained their discipline and their concealment through conditions of genuine and escalating danger considerably beyond what the Farnborough action had required, ultimately engaging UC-71 directly once the concealment could no longer be maintained. But the submarine, damaged in the exchange, succeeded in disengaging and escaping rather than being sunk outright, and Dunraven herself, too badly damaged by the fires and the earlier depth charge explosion to be saved, sank under tow the following day. Two further Victoria Crosses were awarded for the Dunraven action, again distributed by the same ballot provision used for Pargist, a recognition that the value of the engagement and the extraordinary courage it had demonstrated was not diminished by the absence of a confirmed kill, and that the broader deterrent and psychological effect of every Q-ship engagement, successful or not, contributed to a cumulative pressure on U-boat commanders that extended well beyond the raw tally of submarines actually sunk. Other Q-ship commanders and crews added their own actions to the program's record across 1917 and into 1918, a period during which the growing German awareness that the Q-ship threat was real, and not merely a rumor circulating among cautious submarine commanders, began to alter U-boat tactics in ways that gradually reduced the specific tactical opening the entire program had been built to exploit. Lieutenant William Sanders, commanding the small three-masted schooner HMS Prize, a genuinely unarmed-looking sailing vessel disguised with concealed weaponry in a manner considerably more elaborate than the more straightforward steamship conversions, engaged the German submarine UB-48 in April 1917 in an action that saw Prize's crew maintain their concealment and their panic party deception through sustained close-range fire from the submarine, ultimately engaging and severely damaging UB-48 before the submarine disengaged, an action for which Sanders was awarded the Victoria Cross, one of the small number of Q-ship VCs awarded to officers commanding the specific category of sailing vessel decoys that formed a distinct and, in some respects, even more elaborately disguised subset of the broader program, the sailing ship Q-ships, of which Prize was among the most celebrated examples, presented their own particular set of tactical advantages and constraints. A disguised sailing vessel, relying on wind rather than a betraying trail of engine smoke, could appear even more thoroughly innocuous to an approaching submarine than a disguised steamer, since sailing coasters and small schooners remained a genuinely common sight in the shipping lanes of the period and carried none of the mechanical sophistication that might, in a suspicious commander's mind, hint at a naval conversion. Their concealed armament had to be built into hull and rigging structures never designed to carry it, however, a considerably more demanding engineering challenge than converting a steel-hulled steamer, and their reliance on wind for maneuverability introduced a further element of unpredictability into any engagement that a steamship's more reliable engine power did not share across the full run of the war. Historians examining the Q-ship program's actual combat record have generally credited the roughly 200 vessels commissioned into special service across the conflict with somewhere in the region of a dozen confirmed U-boat kills directly attributable to Q-ship action, a modest figure by comparison to the eventual toll inflicted by the convoy system and by improving anti-submarine technology across the war's final 2 years, but a figure that understates the program's actual strategic contribution considerably, since the great majority of the value the Q-ship delivered lay not in the confirmed kills themselves, but in the psychological effect the mere existence and growing reputation of the program had on the broader conduct of the U-boat campaign as a whole. That psychological effect became, over time, the Q-ship program's most significant and most durable contribution to the broader anti-submarine effort, and it operated through a mechanism the program's own designers had anticipated from the outset, even if the precise scale of the effect proved difficult to measure with any real precision, as German U-boat commanders became increasingly aware, through captured intelligence, through survivor accounts, and through the simple, growing pattern of submarines that failed to return from patrols in circumstances suggesting an engagement with an apparently harmless merchant target, that any given merchant ship countered on the surface might, in fact, be a heavily armed Q-ship in disguise. The entire tactical calculation that had made gun action against merchant shipping the standard, torpedo-conserving default across 1915, 1916, and the early months of 1917 began to shift, gradually but unmistakably, toward greater caution. U-boat commanders who might previously have surfaced without hesitation to engage an apparently unarmed target with their deck gun increasingly began to approach with greater wariness, submerged for longer periods before surfacing, observed potential targets for extended periods through the periscope before committing to an approach, and, in a growing number of documented cases, chose to expend a torpedo on a target that would previously have been considered safe for gun action, precisely because the risk that the target might be a Q-ship in disguise had come to outweigh the value of conserving the torpedo for a more obviously valuable target later in the patrol. This shift, difficult to quantify in any precise statistical sense, but consistently reported in the recollections of surviving U-boat commanders and in the broader post-war assessment of the campaign by naval historians on both sides, meant that the Q-ship program's actual strategic value extended considerably beyond the roughly dozen submarines it can be confidently credited with sinking outright, forcing a change in German tactical doctrine that, in turn, reduced the efficiency of the broader U-boat campaign, increased torpedo expenditure against targets that might previously have been dealt with more cheaply by gunfire, and introduced a persistent, corrosive element of uncertainty and caution into an operational environment that unrestricted submarine warfare had, until the Q-ship's reputation began to spread, allowed German commanders to approach with a confidence the program was specifically designed to undermine. This forced increase in torpedo expenditure carried consequences of its own for the broader German war effort that extended well beyond any single engagement. Torpedo production represented a genuine bottleneck within German wartime industrial capacity, and a U-boat forced to expend torpedoes at a higher rate than her original patrol planning had anticipated faced a shortened effective patrol, an earlier return to base for resupply, and a corresponding reduction in the total tonnage she could realistically expect to sink across a given deployment, multiplied across the entire U-boat fleet over an extended period. This effect, though impossible to isolate with precision from the many other factors shaping the campaign's overall trajectory, represented a genuine drag on German submarine efficiency that the mere existence of the Q-ship threat, independent of any specific engagement, had helped to produce. The cost of achieving that effect, it must be said plainly, fell overwhelmingly on the Royal Navy's own Q-ship crews, rather than on the German U-boat fleet the program was designed to counter, and the program's casualty rate, examined honestly, was severe by almost any standard applied to a single category of naval vessel across the war. Of the roughly 200 ships commissioned into Q-ship service, historians have generally estimated that somewhere in the region of 60 were lost across the war, a loss rate considerably higher, proportionally, than that suffered by most conventional categories of Royal Navy escort vessel across the same period, a reflection of the fundamental and unavoidable vulnerability built into the entire concept from the outset. A Q-ship succeeded only by allowing a submarine to close to short range and to open fire first, absorbing genuine damage and genuine casualties through the opening phase of every engagement, as the price of maintaining the deception long enough for the concealed armament to be brought to bear with decisive effect, and in a meaningful proportion of engagements across the war, that opening exchange of fire, or a subsequent action against a submarine that recognized the deception, or simply proved too well handled to be drawn into the trap fully, resulted in the Q-ship's own loss rather than the submarine's. Crews who volunteered for Q-ship service and service aboard these vessels was formally designated as volunteer duty precisely because the Admiralty recognized the exceptional and specific danger involved, understood from the outset that they were accepting a category of combat risk considerably different from, and in important respects considerably worse than, service aboard a conventional warship, since the entire tactical concept required them to absorb the enemy's opening attack, in many cases while lying motionless and exposed on an open deck with no cover and strict orders not to move or return fire regardless of casualties, until the moment their own commander judged the range and the deception sufficiently complete to spring the trap. The volunteer status of Q-ship service also meant that the men who filled these crews were, in a meaningful sense, self-selected for exactly the kind of nerve and discipline the role demanded. The Admiralty's recruitment for special service duty made the exceptional danger of the assignment clear from the outset rather than concealing it, and the men who came forward regardless did so with a full understanding of what they were accepting. The Q-ship program's operational lifespan, much like several of the other improvised wartime expedients that populate the Royal Navy's broader history of adapting existing or obsolete assets to meet an emerging threat faster than any purpose-built solution could be developed and deployed, minus one relatively brief in relation to the full span of the war, not because the concept had failed, but because its own success had, over time, largely eliminated the specific tactical vulnerability it had been built to exploit, as German U-boat commanders grew increasingly wary of engaging apparently unarmed merchant targets with gunfire at all, preferring instead to submerge and attack with torpedoes even against targets that might genuinely have been harmless. The fundamental premise on which the Q-ship's deception depended, that a U-boat commander would voluntarily surface and close to short range against what he believed to be a defenseless target, became increasingly rare as the war progressed, and the program's rate of successful engagements declined correspondingly through 1917 and into 1918, even as the broader anti-submarine campaign, now increasingly built around the convoy system and improving detection and depth charge technology, began to deliver the kind of sustained, systematic reduction in U-boat effectiveness that no single category of decoy vessel, however successfully deployed, could ever have achieved on its own by the war's final year. The Q-ship specific moment, the narrow window during which German submarine tactics remained sufficiently trusting of apparently unarmed merchant targets to make the deception reliably effective, had substantially passed, superseded by a broader, more comprehensive set of anti-submarine measures that address the U-boat threat through convoy protection and improved detection, rather than through the specific, elaborate theater of disguise and deception the Q-ship had depended on from the outset. The convoy system in particular, once fully and systematically adopted from May 1917 onward, addressed the submarine threat through an entirely different logic than the Q-ship's individual ambush tactic. Rather than waiting for a single submarine to make the specific tactical error of surfacing against a disguised decoy, convoying simply made it considerably harder for a submarine to locate an unescorted target at all, and considerably more dangerous to attack one that was accompanied by armed escorts capable of counterattacking immediately once a submarine's presence was detected, a systemic solution that, unlike the Q-ship's narrow and increasingly outdated exploitation of German overconfidence, continued to deliver value across the entire remaining course of the war, regardless of how German tactical doctrine evolved in response. Gordon Campbell himself, by the war's end, the most decorated Q-ship officer in the entire program, and one of the most decorated officers in the Royal Navy of any category across the whole of the First World War, holding the Victoria Cross along with the Distinguished Service Order and tabars to that decoration, went on to a further career in the interwar Royal Navy and later wrote extensively about his Q-ship service, his published accounts becoming, for much of the 20th century, the primary popular source through which the wider public came to understand what the program had actually involved, the extraordinary discipline the panic party deception demanded of ordinary sailors under genuine and sustained enemy fire, and the specific, narrow tactical logic that had made an apparently harmless collier or tramp steamer, for a brief window in the middle years of the war, one of the most effective anti-submarine weapons available to the Royal Navy at a moment when almost nothing else in the available arsenal could reliably counter the U-boat threat at all. The broader history of the program, and of the roughly 60 ships, and the many hundreds of men lost across its operational life, has generally been assessed by naval historians less as a story of overwhelming tactical success measured purely in submarines sunk, a modest figure by comparison to the eventual scale of the U-boat campaign as a whole, and more as a story of a genuinely desperate improvised response to a crisis that, in the specific months before the convoy system was finally and comprehensively adopted, threatened to defeat Britain through starvation faster than any purpose-built countermeasure could be developed and deployed in time to matter. Viewed in that specific context, as a bridge measure deployed precisely during the period when Britain's institutional and technological response to unrestricted submarine warfare had not yet caught up with the scale of the threat it faced, the Q-ship's contribution takes on a significance that the raw kill count alone considerably understates, a program that bought time, imposed caution, and demonstrated to a German naval command increasingly confident in the success of its own submarine campaign that even the most apparently helpless target on the surface of the ocean might, without warning, prove to be exactly the trap it had been built to be. What the Q-ship program ultimately demonstrated, in a form distinct even from the broader pattern of British naval improvisation that runs through so much of the service's history across both world wars, was that a weapon's effectiveness could be built entirely around the deliberate cultivation of an enemy's own false confidence, rather than around any conventional measure of firepower, speed, or armor at all. A converted collier or fishing smack, disguised and crewed specifically to look and to behave exactly like the harmless, unarmed target a U-boat commander had every rational reason, given the tactical logic of the period, to consider safe to engage with his own deck gun other than a torpedo, achieved its effect not through any inherent military capability the ship herself possessed, since stripped of her concealed armament a Q-ship was, in the most literal sense, exactly the defenseless merchant vessel she appeared to be, but through the sustained, disciplined performance of an entire crew willing to hold fire, absorb incoming damage, and maintain an elaborate and genuinely dangerous deception for as long as it took to draw an overconfident enemy into a position from which escape was no longer possible. Gordon Campbell's crew aboard Farnborough, lying exposed on an open deck, while a German submarine's gunfire straddled and occasionally struck the ship they were pretending to abandon, succeeded not because their concealed guns were more powerful than the weapon they faced. In most engagements the disparity in raw firepower was modest at best, but because they had been trained and were willing to do the one thing the entire tactical logic of the U-boat campaign assumed no merchant crew would ever do: remain, in disguise, under fire, until the precise moment their own patience had turned an enemy's confidence into his own destruction. It was, in the end, A weapon built not from steel or explosive, but from theatre, discipline, and the willingness of ordinary sailors to be shot at without shooting back, for exactly as long as it took to make an overconfident opponent believe, right up until the concealment screens dropped and the guns ran out, that he was looking at nothing more dangerous than one more harmless, an armed ship going about her ordinary business on an empty stretch of sea.